It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Bim Afalami, Labour MP Lloyd Russell-Moyle, Yorkshire Post political correspondent Jerry Scott and academic and author Matthew Goodwin. Today.
It's all money orientated and everything, load of coswallop.
As much as people are angry, I say let's use that anger and make change.
I don't think that it is good news for fans. I don't think it's good news for football in this country.
Not just a big story for football. Politicians are united in opposing plans for a European Super League. He's not a fan of the idea either. Jeremy Corbyn will join us live. The Grenfell inquiry restarts today with evidence from residents.
I remember going to bed thinking, I really hope nothing ever happens.
And can Keir Starmer recharge his party in the Red Wall? Well, you heard in the headlines there the story about 6 Premier League football clubs signing up to a new European Super League. There has been blanket outrage in the world of politics and sport. Let's just show you a couple of the newspaper headlines, starting with the Daily Telegraph. PM, Prime Minister takes on football giants over new Super League plan. And this is how it looks in the Mirror. Disgraceful. Prem Big Six in Euro breakaway. And as a reflection of some of that outrage, let's listen to former Manchester United captain Gary Neville speaking last night.
It's pure greed. They're imposters. They're imposters. They're nothing to do. The owners of this club, the owners of Liverpool, the owners of Chelsea, the owners of Manchester City, they're nothing to do with football in this country. There are 100 and odd years of history in this country from fans that have lived and loved these clubs. And they need protecting. The fans need protecting.
Well, that was Gary Neville. The 6 clubs would still play in the Premier League, but they'd also take part in this European Super League against teams like Real Madrid and Barcelona without having to qualify for it. And there are huge concerns that it will have a very big detrimental financial effect on smaller clubs. So my opening question to the panel, starting with you, Jerry, is why is this such a big story?
Yeah, and look, I'm not going to profess to be some kind of football expert because I'm definitely not, but it really does smack of greed, doesn't it? I think, we've seen throughout the pandemic, for example, football clubs come out about this kind of, feeling of togetherness, supporting the community. We've seen pop-up food banks. I mean, for Christ's sake, Marcus Rashford forcing government U-turns over feeding children, and then to kind of that the bosses now seem to be giving a message that completely reverses that community impact that we've been seeing. And like you say, the reaction across the board has been overwhelmingly negative. I noticed earlier that Man United hadn't even tweeted about the announcement, I imagine through fear of backlash. And it really flies in the face of, I guess, the message that everyone's been trying to get across over the last 12, 18 months about pulling together to beat things.
Right, and on that, Matthew, are you surprised by the sort of ferocity of the response?
No, I'm not surprised. I think people have felt cut adrift from a whole number of institutions in British society for a long period of time. I think it's really interesting that at the same time as we've had this debate in politics, particularly through the Brexit discussion about trying to send powers back down to ordinary people, sport and football, which of course was founded as an arena for ordinary people, has become more insular, has become more detached from public opinion. So there seems to be institutions moving in different ways. And looking across social media this morning, this incident seems to have done something that is quite remarkable in unifying both the left and the right, the pro-EU crowd, the anti-EU crowd, the North and the South. And it seems to really have galvanised a strong consensus that actually we need to try and create more space and more arenas where we can all come together on a level playing field where there's good fair play.
Right. Well, do you see it like that too, Lloyd? A sort of outbreak of political unity then?
I think there probably is an outbreak of political unity here, and it's because there is something universal about the idea that someone can work their way up from potentially the bottom to to the top. And that's not just in football, but that is, I guess, an analogy for life as well. And those are important things. I remember when Brighton joined the Premiership, and that feeling of pride and civic pride. I remember a few months later being in a refugee camp in Bangladesh, where they were listening to Man U playing Brighton. And the idea that that continues into the European League is, I think, vitally important. It's an interesting note, isn't it, that no German clubs have taken part in this. And that is because Germany requires fans to have around 50% of the voting rights on their clubs, directing where their clubs go. That, of course, was a policy that we put forward. And I think there is probably now time to, with this political unity, see if there is some sort of solution, not to remove the owners completely, they have a role, but to say, actually, they're not the only shots in town. The fans and the players need to have a better say in this, and the governance needs to be looked at.
I mean, the issue of fairness, Bim, in the way that the other panellists really have outlined, that it will be so exclusive that so many clubs, other clubs, wouldn't be able to join. It would be this sort of just this elite without competition.
Yes, it appears to me, and look, I'm a suffering football Arsenal fan, so, you know, it appears to me that this is an attempt to create an almost NFL-style thing for European football. And I don't think the owners fully understand British fans, indeed, many fans across Europe. And I think they're finding that out now. What we now need to do moving forward, and look, I agree with so much of what's already been said, so I won't repeat it. But what we now need to do going forward, I think, is to think of two things. First of all, the wider domestic game. Football is not just Arsenal, Man U, Man City, etc. But so the wider domestic game, right down to grassroots, and also the fans, as everybody's mentioned, because, you know, these are the two anchors in so many communities. And the point that Matthew Goodwin made about that in terms of the debates we've been having over the last few years are about people wanting to feel closer with their own communities. And we found that over the coronavirus pandemic, and communities coming together as well. And that's what I'd urge the owners and the clubs more broadly to think about now.
All right, well, from one Arsenal fan to another, former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, and I think a pretty big super fan of Arsenal. How upset are you with your club?
Very upset. Arsenal was founded, like pretty well every other football club, by working class communities getting together to fund their club. There was, in this case, it was workers at the Woolwich Arsenal, and eventually it moved to Highbury in my constituency before the First World War. And gradually the club has become more and more corporate, more and more detached from its supporters, despite having a very good community programme. And I just think this European Super League idea is an absolute no-no. It is owners who seem to have no understanding of the cultural basis of the clubs that they bought. And it will actually be a bit of a boring thing anyway, because if there's no promotion and no relegation from it, it's basically a series of exhibition matches, but it's going to be a lot of money behind it, very heavily promoted and very damaging to the rest of the football community, because football, as Lloyd and others have just said, is actually about Saturday morning and Sunday morning. It's young people playing football. It's boys and girls playing football. They're all losing out as more and more money is taken out of the game by the super rich.
Right, but you accept these clubs are businesses, free to operate as they see fit. I mean, what can actually be done to stop them?
Well, they are businesses, yes, and they do make a very large amount of money. The owners have all bought into the assets they've got. But the issue has to be the role of the fans in this. Fans pay a great deal of money to watch their football, either online or going to the match itself. And so the proposals that we put forward in the last election for democratic participation in the clubs, where the fans would get to elect a director, not a big demand, and much less than already is enjoyed in Germany, would at least mean that fans' voice is there, but also a subvention on the income of the Premier League clubs to fund the rest of football. And so it is also about reform of the Premier League, because the gap between the Premier League, Championship, Leagues 1 and 2 is absolutely huge. And at the grassroots level, football is dying through Corona partly, but also because of the lack of funding. And unless there is more resources put into it, we lose it. Now, football, okay, it's a game, it's a sport, but it's also part of the community. But it's also very important for young people to understand the principle of teamwork and they understand the principle of fitness and skill and of training. And that is a huge part of what is the game that we all love.
Right. I mean, we've had quite strong statements from both the Prime Minister and the Culture Secretary. So would you agree the government's taking this pretty seriously?
Well, they've made strong statements, but they need to follow that up. They need to follow that up with the policies, I believe, that we put forward, which is about democratic participation in this, where the fans get a real voice, they get to say what's going on, they get to fix on ticket prices as well. The German model is basically quite a good one. It's very interesting that the German clubs have all said they want nothing to do with this. And of the clubs so far named, there seems to be a huge imbalance with 6 English clubs in of a league that's going to be of 12. Well, of course I love the English football, we all do, but it's not the only show in town. There's lots of other football all across Europe. Surely they need some fair participation. This Super League idea is a real no-no. It's based on greed. It's based on damaging football for the want of making a great deal of money out of it and turning it into a global brand.
Right, you mentioned the manifesto, the Labour manifesto in 2019, where there were proposals, as you say, to look at the governance and regulation. Now, Keir Starmer's repeatedly said the party's under new management, but presumably you'd like him to keep that bit of the manifesto.
Well, that part of the manifesto, as indeed many other parts, was very, very popular. And I would have thought it would be good sense to not just keep that policy, but to expand it. And now to consult with the entire football community on how this more democratic model will actually work. But above all, it is about redistributing the wealth of football into the totality of the game. Otherwise, where are the stars of tomorrow if we don't fund the grassroots football properly today?
Right, and you said it's about the fans. You're a fan. You can vote with your feet, can't you? You could, I suppose, give up your Arsenal season ticket if that's what you've got. Is that what people should do?
Well, I share an Arsenal season ticket with my sons, and we go to matches, obviously at the moment not at all, but when we can, and I love going there. I don't want to walk away from Arsenal. It's part of my community. I live right near the stadium. I love the buzz of a match day. But I'm not very interested in watching exhibition matches between super rich players in super rich clubs. I want to see real football. So I think I'm going to be, along with an awful lot of other people, who simply won't be bothered to get involved in the Super League because we like football. We don't like money and exhibitions. OK,
Jeremy Corbyn, thank you very much. Bim, listening to that, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport has said it is looking at options to intervene, but football is a free market. What can the government actually do?
Well, I think that the point around participation of fans is very important. I think we should look to strengthen that. It's worth saying, though, that, you know, if you look at Real Madrid, Barcelona, AC Milan, they all elect their presidents, for example. So it is not a silver bullet necessarily for the things we're talking about. What the government needs to do, in my view, is to strengthen the ability of local communities with their local football clubs, strengthen the and lean on the FA and others to increase the amount of money going into grassroots sport, as I played when I was a boy, and thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of boys and girls play across the country. So it's strengthen the money, make sure that fans have more of a voice. And those sorts of things, in combination with talking to the owners and the clubs at a very high level and educating them on how much opposition this proposal has engendered. In addition to that, I think that they're the sorts of things the government should be looking at, and I know Oliver Dowden will be doing so.
Matthew?
Well, I think the Conservative government has to do something on this. The other thing, of course, Joe, is that many of the people who are voicing outrage are in areas that have become much more competitive politically. Many of the people, for example, around Liverpool and Manchester are in many of these newly competitive constituencies that both Labour and the Conservatives are going to be fighting over increasingly. So I think inevitably, given the scale of consensus that we can see coming out over the last 24 hours, something will be done inevitably.
Lloyd?
Well, a lot of these clubs, you talk about them being companies, which might be true legally, but they will have had planning permission for stadiums to be built based on the fact that they'll be doing sports and campaigns, community activities. They will be given special licenses and even at times grants to have got up and going. And if they're basically going to move from sports to entertainment, because that's all the European Super League seems to be to me, kind of an entertainment firm, then actually some of those issues need to be re-looked at as well. What planning permissions do they have just to run entertainment activities? Are they still sports clubs, particularly if the English league says that they would be excluded from playing those matches? So there are some other levers that could be used here. I must admit, I personally prefer going along and watching Whitehawk or Telscombe and Peacehaven FC, non-league clubs. But there is an important role for those big clubs to be able to support those non-league sides, because that's where the talent is fostered.
Right. Well, Oliver Dowden, the Culture Secretary, is expected to give a statement later on in the House of Commons this afternoon. Jerry, how bad is this, do you think, for communities if it were to go ahead that have lower league football clubs?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point. And I was going to build on what we said about Brexit earlier. Actually, if you look at, the Tories, the seats they won in the 2019 election, a lot of the red wall, blue wall seats that I report on, the message that they've been told over and over is that this is about rebuilding communities, revigorating high streets, putting money into town centres. And a big part of that is things like these football clubs, who people really feel are part of their communities. If the situation financially from the Super League means that they're going to suffer, that's not going to play well politically either. Right,
and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later in the programme. Joining us now is Kate Lamble. We're going to move on to something different. Producer of the BBC's Grenfell Tower Inquiry podcast. Welcome to you, Kate. The Grenfell Inquiry is restarting today. What's different about this stage, phase 2?
Sure. So over the last year, we've had lots of evidence from the people involved in the Grenfell Tower refurbishment, designers, contractors, those who manufactured the combustible materials. But now it's turning its attention to the management of Grenfell Tower. So whether the tenant management organisation and the local council, the RBKC, fulfilled their responsibilities on things like fire risk assessments, installing fire doors, and importantly, residents' complaints. And that's where we started this morning. One resident said that he felt that when he complained, management companies looked down on the residents and didn't listen when he warned about issues that he considered put lives at risk.
Right, and we're going to listen to a little excerpt, a bit of the evidence given by Lee Chapman. You heard a bit of him in the headlines. They're a leaseholder and resident who had, as you were saying, expressed concerns about the refurbishment of the tower. He was away when the fire happened, but his wife had a miraculous escape. Let's have a listen.
But being so high up, knowing that that communal stairwell is your only way of getting out, was my big worry at that time. And I remember going to bed thinking, I really hope nothing ever happens.
Really?
But what can you do? You live somewhere and you have to trust that the people that are responsible for that building are looking after the health and safety, because that's normally the number one thing that everyone worries about, in day-to-day life.
And also, Kate, tell us a little bit more about what else has been said by the lawyers on behalf of the bereaved families.
Sure. So before Easter, we had the opening statements for this section of the inquiry. So the lawyers for the bereaved and survivors accused the council of creating a chronic culture of neglect and indifference. Others said it was a landmark act of discrimination against disabled and vulnerable people. We know that more than 40% of vulnerable people living in Grenfell died on the night of the fire. Other lawyers said there was no evidence that the council assessed any of the vulnerable residents to see how they could get out of the building in an emergency situation. So it'll be really interesting later in the week when we hear from the tenant management organisation and the council when they give evidence about what they're going to say about these accusations.
And what are the timings in terms of evidence and hearings going ahead?
So we're hearing from residents most of this week. We're going to start hearing from the tenant management organisation on Thursday, and going forward this whole section is going to last probably until July, when it moves on to new subjects about the London Fire Brigade. And then in October through to December, we're going to hear from the government about those who set the regulations.
Kate, thank you very much. Now, as you will know, if you are a regular watcher of Politics Live, we have an important set of elections and a wide-ranging set of elections coming up on May the 6th. We're going to catch up with the political correspondent Alex Forsyth, who is in Hartlepool, where a by-election will be happening on that date. Hello to you, Alex. I mean, how emblematic is Hartlepool in the North East in the battle for areas that were known as traditional Labour heartlands?
Well, Joe, it might look like a beautiful, peaceful, sunny Monday morning here in Hartlepool, but don't be fooled, because there is a pretty ferocious political fight going on here, because as you say, this is a seat with real significance. Now, in this by-election contest, there are some 16 candidates standing, among them, of course, Labour, who have held this seat for decades and they want to hold on to it now, and the Conservatives, who want to take it from Labour. Now, at the 2019 general election, this was one of the seats that Labour held on to in Hartlepool, where around this part of the northeast coast with its industrial history, a lot of the other seats turned blue. Now here in 2019, the Brexit Party took a sizable chunk of the vote. Now that party no longer exists, but its new form, Reform UK, is putting up a candidate, a guy called John Prescott, not the former Labour Deputy Prime Minister, I hasten to add, but a businessman from the northeast. So he will be standing. It will be interesting to see what happens to that chunk of the vote. The other two major parties here, Labour and the Conservatives. Labour have Paul Williams, who's an NHS doctor. Their messaging very much focused on public services, investment in policing and the NHS and local facilities. And for the Conservatives, Jill Mortimer, who is a farmer from the North East, their messaging very much about what the Conservative government would do in terms of investment and regeneration for this part of the country. And a sign of how seriously the parties are taking this, we have had a whole host of really senior party figures coming to Hartlepool over the course of the last few weeks. A lot of social media. The ground war has started in earnest, a real sign of what is at stake.
Well, it's looking lovely and sunny, if a little windy there behind you, Alex. I mean, how big a verdict will this be on the leadership of the two main parties for Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer?
A really big one, because of course for Sir Keir Starmer this is the first big electoral test of whether or not his party under new leadership can hold on to these seats where it has traditionally been so strong, but where support has been ebbing away. This will see whether or not Sir Keir Starmer's Labour Party can do what Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party couldn't. And of course for Boris Johnson, the big test is whether or not what happened in 2019 was a one-off because of Brexit, where he did really eat into that Labour vote. This was a heavily voting Leave seat in Hartlepool. But of course Brexit isn't at the front of people's minds as it was back in December 2019 right now. The pandemic has pushed quite a lot of that aside. And so it will see for Boris Johnson whether or not that was something that happened once, or whether or not that's marking a bit of a sea change in politics where the Tories are really establishing a true foothold in seats like this. So there is an enormous amount to play for, which is why the street game, the ground game is so fierce here in a way that we haven't really seen in other electoral campaigns across the country this time round because of COVID rules. It will be a test for both party leaders of just what the electorate think about them right now.
Alex, thank you very much there in Hartlepool. And you can find more information about the candidates and the by-election on the BBC website on the politics pages. Now, moving away from Hartlepool, but sticking broadly with electoral prospects of the two main parties, I just want to show our viewers this article written by one of the panellists, Matthew Goodwin, in Unheard. Why Keir Starmer is doomed. Voters want a Prime Minister who believes in Britain. Matthew, explain.
Sure. What we're living through is a realignment of British politics, and we're seeing, as Alex mentioned, the Conservatives doing much better in historic Labour territory. And I think the important thing for Labour to remember is that there are a lot more seats in the Red Wall that could still fall to the Conservatives that have fallen into marginal status. They could be won by a very small swing to the Conservatives. And I think so far we've heard a lot about the economic story, how Labour wants to get back into the economic story. But unfortunately, our politics is now also being pulled apart by these cultural divides. And one of those divides, I think, is really about whether or not people feel that political leaders are on the side of the country, whether they feel that those leaders believe in the country, whether they're comfortable with patriotism and all of the things that lots of voters, particularly in Red Wall seats, really care about. And if you look at the polling data and the evidence on where Labour is at the moment, I think one of the big concerns for Keir Starmer and his team is that they don't seem to be cutting through on those cultural factors. And that is a really big problem, because we can see that the Conservatives are very willing to talk about those issues, about Brexit, about power and influence, levelling up and all of those kinds of things. It's very difficult now for Labour because we're not in that early 1990s period when you might remember Bill Clinton's strategist once said, it's the economy, stupid. Well, it's no longer just the economy, stupid. It's the economy and culture, stupid. And Labour currently are struggling to adapt to that new reality.
Lloyd?
There is a struggle, of course, in terms of cultural discussions. I don't think it's as simple as saying that Keir or anyone in Labour doesn't believe in Britain. It's about what kind of Britain we believe in. You're right, Labour only wins when the public feel that Labour wants a better, more progressive Britain, whether it's, kind of a country fit for heroes, or whether it's the white heat of technology, or whether it's cool Britannia. So, of course, we need to put forward our vision. But my view is that kind of proudly patriotic kind of view that was expressed actually at the opening ceremony of the Olympics, proud of our NHS, understanding of our history, where we got it wrong and where we got it right. Those are the things that Labour embodies, not just a whitewash of our culture. And I actually think that a lot of people everywhere, including the Red Wall, will start to see through some of these Tory rhetorics. Levelling up actually is now turning to sleaze and cronyism. Kind of actually speaking up for the country is now leading to actually dividing the country up, where you see troubles in Northern Ireland again and a resurgent Scotland that wants independence. That's not proud to be British. That's actually destroying some of the very fundamental things that I am proud about being British for, because we have fought and struggled. And that's the story and narrative of Britain. And I think it might take a little while for Keir to start turning that around, because the cultural war has happened across Europe and across the Western world. But I think he will do, because people will see through what the Conservatives actually are. It's the same old Conservatives, the same sleaze that we had in the 90s. We're now seeing it now. Matt Hancock's pub landlord rings him up and he gets a multi-million-pound contract. That's the kind of stuff that happens.
All right, I will come to BIM, of course, in just a moment to respond to those last few points. But Matthew, more broadly on what you heard from Lloyd.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, there's something not connecting with Keir Starmer. You can see it in his leadership ratings. They're not strong enough. And people often say at this point, well, actually, what you really need is an election campaign, because then people really tune into leaders. We've just been sat at home for a year. People have had nothing to do other than watch the news. And they are still saying that they don't feel that Keir Starmer looks like a prime minister in waiting. And one of the problems that makes this different from Cool Britannia in 1997, which was a brief moment in the history of the Labour Party, is the Labour Party activist base has completely changed. It's become much more progressive. It's become more woke. And that has introduced huge problems for Labour, because every time Keir Starmer says, look, I'm patriotic, I fly the flag, I believe in Britain, and he genuinely probably does. But the problem is, every time he does that, he has the progressive activists within the Labour Party saying, well, he's being racist and he's being, old-fashioned, and actually he's not talking enough about all of these other problems like racism and empire and historic injustices, which are important, but most people don't want to talk about those issues every day. Most people want to talk about normal issues. So Keir Starmer, unlike Tony Blair, has now got a formidable obstacle within his own party, which is an activist base that is deeply unrepresentative of wider Britain.
Lloyd?
Tony Blair, I think, and put the two together. If you think about tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, you speak to both those bases. You say, yes, we do want to stop crime and the scourge of it, and the lock 'em up community kind of can get behind that. But you also say there are underlying causes of crime, there are underlying issues around poverty, around understanding people's role in the community. Keir needs to, of course, to be able to do the same, to bridge the gap between those who see the world through a kind of a liberal viewpoint, and those that see the world through a communitarian viewpoint. I think he can do that. The jury is still out, of course, but these things take time to build. And that coalition that was built before can be built again. And actually, journalists keep trying to dig up kind of the one or two tweets from disgruntled members saying that X, Y, and Z actually isn't a reflection of, I think, the Labour Party or most voting people who vote for the Labour Party. They want fairness, and whether that's fairness for black people or fairness for white people, they want fairness, and that's what we will focus on rather than trying to divide and rule, because that's what the other side is doing.
Matthew?
Well, I'm just not entirely sure what that really means. I mean, I think if you look just at the strategic problem for Labour, you've already got the Liberal vote. You've already got the social liberals in London and university towns. The problem Labour has is it's stacking up votes in areas where it doesn't need votes, and it's losing votes in areas where it doesn't have votes. So somewhere between now and the next election, Labour has got to win back England. Now, Labour has not won the popular vote in England since 2001. That means Labour's going to have a very big, loud conversation with working class voters that voted for Brexit, that want lower immigration, and they want their national leaders to say, there's a lot of good things happening in Britain. We're not just racist. We're not just a former imperial power. We're not just a terrible...
Lloyd,
every day on
no
social
one is
media,
saying that Britain is
lots of people saying that.
Let Lloyd respond. Let Lloyd respond to that. Go on, Lloyd.
I think there is a small minority of people on Twitter that nobody follows, really. You know, 'cause Twitter is an echo chamber that kind of will say these ridiculous things, and then people, politicos, us, we pick them up and treat them like that's a mainstream conversation. In the liberal streets of Brighton, nobody is disparaging Britain. They are proud of Britain as much as they are everywhere in this country. It's about what kind of Britain we want to project. I agree with you. Some people, particularly I think on the Conservative side, are trying to use this as a wedge issue, trying to claim that Labour Party is not patriotic. But I think that actually the message that Labour will put forward is a slow burn and will get there. But what we can't do is suggest somehow, which is just fantasy, that Labour people are kind of disparaging Britain, or even think that, you know, kind of that Britain is a horrible place to be. I am deeply proud, and I think every single one of my MPs and every single one of my members is deeply proud of Britain, but we think it can be better.
I think the problem is what Ronald Reagan said to Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter said, there's a malaise in American society, there's a problem with America, and he talked a lot about the problems. And as Ronald Reagan reminded Jimmy Carter, people don't always want to hear about what's wrong with their country. They also want to hear about what's right with their country, because they derive a great deal of their esteem and their sense of belonging from their national identity. And unfortunately, I think, you know, take the debate we had over the race report 2 weeks ago, when we had Clive Lewis, a Labour MP, not a random person on Twitter, comparing the author of that report to a member of the Ku Klux Klan, because it didn't fit with this narrative that we now have, which says that actually Britain is a fundamentally, institutionally backward racist country. And most people don't think like that. They don't feel like that. People get control of the narrative.
Backward is not a word that was used in any of the debate last week. It is your projection on what's being said. You can say we have done things wrong. You can say that there is racism in Britain and there is institutional racism in Britain, and equally say that on the whole we're getting it right. And I'm proud that we're able to get things right, but there are still things to do. Right. We have to be able to have duality in politics. Otherwise, we get to a very dangerous binary element of just saying it's either that or this. And that's why slogans like tough on crime, tough on the cause of crime, were so important to Labour rebirth in the new Labour era. And that's where we need to redo it.
I must bring the others in who have been sitting and listening patiently. Well, I hope they've been listening anyway. Bim, we heard there from Lloyd earlier on in the conversation that he feels that voters are beginning to see through this Conservative government and its commitment, as it sets out, to levelling up, to use the government's phrase. And it's not just the opposition saying those sorts of things. If we show you this headline in The Observer from yesterday, this is a Tory MP, Bernard Jenkin, saying, act now on sleaze crisis or lose red wall votes, Boris Johnson warned. Is he right?
Well, I think that in relation to the broader issues that Lloyd and Matthew were talking about, the thing I'd add is simply to say it's important that for the Conservative Party and indeed for the Labour Party, that it's not either or. It's not economics or culture. It's not patriotism or how much money's in your wallet. All of these things are together and we need to think about them together. And so levelling up isn't just a question about how proud you are of your area. It's also an economic question and it's an educational question. So I think that that's what we understand, and that's why we're doing well in a lot of these areas, because we understand the combination.
Right, and on this specific...
The point you made around on sleaze, on so-called sleaze. Look, when it comes to this Greensill thing, we've done everything that we can. We set up an inquiry. A lot of these things, frankly, to do with the civil servants as well, happened before Boris Johnson's premiership. We are being as transparent as we possibly can. We are publishing more information on meetings and lobbyists than anybody's ever done before. The person who's in charge of this inquiry, Nigel Boardman, you know, when I was a corporate lawyer in the city, I never worked with him, but his reputation is universal in terms of how esteemed he is as a lawyer and how competent and capable he is. He will get to the bottom of every single aspect of this. And in some ways, it actually shows that the transparency is working. The fact we're having this conversation, the fact that when certain things went into the Treasury, the Chancellor and ministers, they were referred to officials, and the money was not given. So
yeah, but hang on. Let's just be clear. Newspapers and journalists uncovered this trail of connections and the scandal, as it's now known, around lobbying rather than transparency in government, particularly. But Jerry, is this cutting through with your readers?
I think in a way, yes. And just to return to the levelling up point, I do a lot of reporting on levelling up. Obviously, it's very big for our part of the world. And the problem the government has with the levelling up agenda is there is no measurement about how it can be delivered or at what stage it's been done. There is no get levelling up done. So I think that's very challenging for them. It will be challenging, if not in 2024, then in the election after. In terms of cut through, I think the sleaze scandal is getting cut through because people want to feel like they have a fair chance. And this is what the whole levelling up agenda kind of embodies, that if you were born in Barnsley, you have exactly the same opportunities as a child born, in the southeast or in London. So if there is a kind of perception that actually there isn't a fair shot here, this isn't a level playing field, there aren't equal opportunities for everyone, then I do think that could put, politically, the Conservatives in a very, very difficult position. And if they can't start to demonstrate how people's lives are being actually improved by levelling up, and there's a sense of unfairness, I do think they'll come unstuck with this.
Right, are you seeing evidence of that already in terms of response to the sleaze crisis?
So I think in speaking to voters ahead of the local elections, they're definitely aware of it. Whether it's cutting through in terms of how, say those votes might translate in May is one thing. I think what it will be is actually how this is responded to when this review comes back, what action is taken, which will demonstrate it. But at the moment, yeah, people are angry in these seats that I report on, and they do feel like, it's one rule for them and another for us.
Right, I'm just going to show you something else, and Jerry, I'd like you to comment on it. In a letter, 6 opposition parties have urged the Speaker of the House of Commons, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, to allow MPs to vote on an inquiry into what they have called the Prime Minister's failure to be honest in the statements he gives to MPs. Caroline Lucas, the Green MP, organised the letter, and there are other signatories from those parties that I mentioned. Do you think this has got a chance, Jerry, of getting anywhere?
So potentially, I think that the fact that Labour hasn't backed it is going to, make it a bit more difficult. And of course, there's a Labour source report, I believe, to have said that Labour wouldn't usually back initiatives launched by other parties. I actually think that's one of the key problems that Keir Starmer and Labour are facing in red wall, blue wall seats, that there is no kind of action plan. It's all very well to oppose, but without saying what you would do differently. And things like this, not signing letters such as this, make that even more evident. I think without Labour backing, it's going to be difficult to get anything off the ground.
Right.
But I also don't think these kind of things make the cut through, as we were speaking about before.
Lloyd, you want to respond?
Well, we had a vote in Parliament only a week or so ago about an independent inquiry around this that the Labour Party led on. I think this letter is good and it's important, but it's not the case that every single person needs to sign up to every single letter. Not every single one of those people who have signed that letter spoke in the debate around having an inquiry on the sleaze and corruption in the government. And I don't blame them for that, because that's politics, is sometimes needing multiple sources, multiple ways of getting the message out. And it's totally unhelpful. And actually, I would suggest maybe cynical, because we've got local elections coming up, that suddenly parties are trying to point at each other. You've done more than me on this and you've done less. And actually, the letter's really important and good. Labour Party has put forward the vote. We lost the vote, unfortunately, a week and a bit ago, and we will continue to push this matter. And that's why I sit on the Public Affairs Committee, and we have launched a full inquiry into some of this stuff. We will be calling Cameron, and we will be calling top people in the government to account for not only the lobbying scandal, but what we will look at is generally how public life and Nolan principles are upheld, because at the moment something's dreadfully gone wrong.
Right, and
the Prime Minister.
Right, and I want to point, Bim, to one or two of the examples that this letter that has been signed by the signatories of these opposition parties. One of them is around the Prime Minister making inaccurate comments in the Commons. They recall Boris Johnson saying the economy had grown by 73% under the Conservatives, which wasn't true. The economy grew 73% between 1990 and 2017. Which includes, of course, as you all know, 13 years with Labour in power. Should he be more careful and make a much greater effort to be accurate?
Well, look, I think that some of those things, it sort of depends exactly what the words we use at any particular point. But I do know that if the Prime Minister said something that's factually inaccurate, then the ministers report to the House and they correct the record. But some of the things in that letter were just transparently trying to make trouble. You've got an accusation that a grant of £5,000 for nurses isn't restoring the nurses' bursary. Well, it appears to be, £5,000 grant.
Right. Well, hang on, Bim. Hang on, Bim. Let me give you
things as well.
Let me give you another example. And actually, did Boris Johnson correct the record there? On that example that I read? I don't remember it. Another claim they cite is Boris Johnson falsely claiming the number of families living in poverty have been cut by 400,000 since 2010. BBC Reality Check looked into this, and Boris Johnson made the claim repeatedly, especially during the 2019 general election. And they couldn't find any evidence that it was true or where the number came from. And they asked Downing Street for the source of the figure, and they didn't supply it.
Well, look, I don't know. What I do know is that when it comes to poverty statistics, there's often a huge amount of debate because different organisations and different people use different assessments of poverty. So that may be the issue in relation to that particular stat. But the broader point is this. What's happening is that the opposition parties do not have a strong political argument. They are trying to get into the minds of the public before local elections that somehow the government isn't being straight with what we're doing and how we're trying to achieve and deliver for communities up and down this country. They're not making a political argument. They're not saying what they would do better. And this just illustrates their weakness. And it illustrates the fact that we are actually delivering the mass of people in this country. And that's what they need to tackle, rather than trying to suggest that the government isn't doing what we've said we're going to do.
Well, let's get Lloyd. Do you accept what Bim is saying, that mistakes are often made, and according to Bim, they're corrected?
Well, we haven't seen enough correction for a lot of them. A number of the crony contracts that were signed, you have people who are husbands and wives taking multi-million contracts for track and trace that completely failed. You've seen, of course, this whole issue now of misstatements, or we could possibly even go as far as saying lies, but we've got to be careful about that word. Parliament that weren't corrected. We've seen the lobbying scandal, and the problem is, it's not that British Steel was saved, for example, with Greensill. It hasn't been, and actually it's now in jeopardy because of the mess that we find ourselves in. It's not that track and trace worked really well, despite giving it to your mates. It actually failed, and it was a disaster. It's not that actually the system for getting products and PPE in the country worked well at the beginning. In fact, it was really difficult at the beginning. So the public could be forgiven of these things if it meant that government was actually working better for people. But it's not.
OK,
billions of money.
I know you've said, but we haven't got much time. I just want to get, Matthew, your take on the importance of being accurate.
I think there's a real risk for the government at the moment that the sleaze story, the cronyism story, the accuracy point begins to spiral into something much bigger, as we saw during the 1990s. And one brief thing to mention, Joe, on Jen's point about us lacking a metric for levelling up. I'm actually working with the Legatum Institute on building a metric that can track levelling up over time.
You've got 10 seconds.
Many of the Red Wall seats have lots of challenges, very real challenges, that do not seem to be currently being prepared.
All right. That's all we've got time for. Thank you for stopping at that point. I'll be back tomorrow at 12:15. Thank you to my guests.